Hello, and welcome to the second episode of This Week with the Periodic Calendar. Now in this series, we're going to be exploring history and the periodic calendar 1 week at a time as a means to both expand our context of history and to make a case that the periodic calendar represents a far more realistic and consistent way to regard the past. So, what happened this week in history? Well, we got a few carryovers from last week, and on last Tuesday we said that the first Pony Express rider left St. Joe, Missouri. Well, it's 11 days later, in 1860, that on this Saturday, the first Pony Express rider arrives in Sacramento, California. Also on last Tuesday, we mentioned how the Titanic sea trials were beginning, and it is on Wednesday of this week, in 1912, that the Titanic leaves port in Southampton, England. Now, for the first 3 days, the passengers enjoy their ride, but it is on this Sunday at 11:40 p.m. that the Titanic hits the iceberg, and it only takes 2 hours and 40 minutes for the unsinkable ship to sink. Now, that happens on Monday morning, and it is Monday morning that the world finds out about this tragedy. And this is one of these events where I feel like the periodic calendar's referencing of the day of the week that it actually happened on really is part of the story, because this happening Sunday and then finding out about it Monday, that is how the chain of events went. So to say it happened on a Wednesday and that the world found out about it on a Thursday, it's a completely different context. So you're leaving something out by referencing it with the old ways. Now also last Thursday, in 1976, Apple was founded. 10 days later, on this Sunday, their first product is released. It's the original Apple computer, hand-built by Steve Wozniak. The Apple I is released on this Sunday, 1976. Then, last Saturday, we went to Pocahontas' wedding on Saturday. That was 1614. Well, a year earlier, on this Saturday, 1613, Pocahontas was captured, and she was offered as, she was ransomed off in exchange for prisoners that her father was holding. So looking at this week in history, there's two themes that kind of stick out, and that's slavery and outer space. Now, we talked about a little of the Civil War last week, so we'll start there. Now, it's on Friday of this week, in 1861, that the Civil War begins. First shots are fired at Fort Sumner on this day, and on Saturday, the day after, Fort Sumner falls, and the Confederates get their first victory of the war. Now, 4 years later, on this Sunday in 1865, the Civil War ends. Now, using the periodic calendar is the only way you are going to see these events references as they are. Now, Civil War began in a Tuesday year, so that's going to line up this year, but the Civil War ending happened on April 9th, 1865 at the Appomattox Courthouse, and April 9th this year falls on a Tuesday. So anywhere else you hear about this year, they're going to say Civil War ended on a Tuesday. Of course, next year, they're going to say it ended on a Wednesday, and then it began on a Saturday. It's all over the place. With the periodic calendar, there's our reference point for the beginning and the ending of the Civil War, and it happened over a 3-day weekend. Also this week, Wednesday, the New York Slave Revolt of 1917 occurs on Wednesday, and then on Sunday in 1860, we've got the Barbados Slave Rebellion beginning. Now, as if we're on a completely different planet, it turns out that this is a big week for the United States Space Shuttle program. On Sunday, in 1981, the Columbia, the first space shuttle, has its first launch. Then on Monday of this week, the Challenger has its first launch in 1983. And on Thursday of the week, that same mission had the first shuttle spacewalk. Now also on this Thursday in 1957, we got the Mercury 7 announced. That's the first 7 American astronauts. And then on Saturday, Apollo 13 is launched in 1970. Tom Hanks made the movie about it. 2 days later, their oxygen tanks explode, so they don't get to make it to the moon, but they do return safely to Earth. Okay, so when you're talking about what happens on this day in history, there's going to be certain events that fall into these lists, and a lot of those are going to be beginnings and endings. We never hear about the middle, but we know when something started or stopped. And so to get our bad news out of the way, let's go with the endings from this week. On Monday in 1882, Jesse James was shot by the coward Robert Ford. On Thursday in 1919, Zapata, one of the leaders of the Mexican Revolution, was shot. And then, let's move this guy up a little bit. In 1945, make room for FDR dies in office on this Thursday. A little happier ending. On Friday in 1933, Prohibition for beer ends. And it was on Saturday of this week that Anheuser-Busch sends a case of beer to the White House via a team of Clydesdales. Now, and then also on Friday in 2005, 4 million mourners go to the funeral of Pope John Paul II. Now, in terms of beginnings, on Monday, after a 1,500-year hiatus, the first modern Olympic Games opens in Athens in 1896. Also on this day in 49, NATO is created, and then in 69, the Internet's symbolic birth date is this Monday. On Tuesday in 1867, the Senate approved the treaty of our purchase of Alaska from Russia. And then in 1957, the Suez Canal opened. Moving on to Wednesday, 1808, John Jacob Astor founds his first company, the American Fur Company, and this is the company that makes his first million. Now, he wasn't the first American millionaire, but he did become the first American multimillionaire. And then 100 years later, on the same Wednesday, very fittingly, Harvard votes to start the Harvard Business School. Thursday, 1710, the first copyright law goes into force. That's the Statute of Anne. Then in 1904 on Friday, Longacre Square becomes Times Square. Then a less happy Friday, this was an ending that snuck in, 1970, Paul McCartney announces that he's leaving the Beatles on this Friday. A less happy Friday there. Then finishing off on Saturday, 1911, superconductivity is discovered on a Saturday, and then our wedding for the week, the day after Pope John Paul's funeral, we've got Prince Charles and Camilla Bowles getting married in 2005. And that's our week in history. Now once again, with the periodic calendar, the difference you're seeing is all of these events are anchored to the day of the week that they actually occurred on, whereas with our regular calendar, it goes by the day of the month. But the day of the month can fall on any day of the week given the year. And if you go look up any of these anniversaries on the regular calendar, only the ones in orange are going to match. Next year, the ones in purple are going to line up. The year after that, these light blue ones. And every year it's a little different. But with the periodic calendar, this is history as it happened. Okay. And then finally, there's going to be a few things that you're going to hear about this week that didn't even happen this week according to the periodic calendar. First edition of the Webster's Dictionary, next week. Polio vaccine announced, next week. The MoMA in New York opened next week, or founded next week. But we'll save all that for then. For now, that's it for this week. Thanks again for watching.